dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today I've got another book talk video to share with you guys. And today we are talking about Mr. Flood's Last Resort by Jess Kidd. One little tidbit about this book that I found kind of interesting is that after I was done reading it and I had gathered all my thoughts, I went to Goodreads just to kind of see what the general vibe was on the book. And I typed into the search bar, Mr. Flood's Last Resort by Jess Kidd. And then what came up was The Hoarder by Jess Kidd. I was like, that's not the book. So then I start reading the blurb about it, and I'm like, wait, that is the book. So I guess, depending on where you purchase the book, it has different titles, which is weird. I've never seen that before. But the title that is here in Canada is Mr. Flood's Last Resort. And I'm happy about that because I think if it was called The Hoarder, I wouldn't have picked it up, honestly. Like, I wouldn't have picked it up, period, to even read what it said on the back. Because that title, if anything, would more likely push me away from the story than towards it. But here it is, The Hoarder. I don't even think it's a great name for the story. We'll get into that. Let's just jump on into it. So this story has two main characters. One is Mr. Flood. He's a cranky old man who lives in this beautiful, large, old home. His son thinks it's time for him to move out and go to an old age home, but Mr. Flood does not want that, not one bit. He wants to stay there. He wants to live out his life the way that he wants to. You know, he's in fairly good health for his age, and I'm thinking, I don't know if we're ever told exactly his age, and if we are, I don't remember it, but I'm thinking late 80s. So, you know, he's in fairly good health. He doesn't want to leave his home. So that's kind of where Mr. Flood is coming from. So they kind of make a deal with him. They're like, okay, you cranky old man, as long as you aren't bothering anybody, then you can stay. So he's like, okay. So his son hires an agency to provide him with a caregiver to, you know, come in, help out with the housework, because it's a big old house. And but the thing that starts happening is he starts running off these housekeepers. One will come in, they'll work for a while, and then they'll quit. Or even more dramatic, like they'll leave crying, and it's just this whole ordeal. So eventually we meet our second main character, and her name is Maud. And she's a tough cookie. Like, she's ready to handle him. What we know about Maud at the beginning is that she's herself has gone through some trauma. Through little bits and pieces throughout the book, we start piecing together a bit of Maud's story from her childhood, where one day her sister just disappears. And that's something that's kind of haunted her for her entire life, as it would. And so we piece this together, that this has happened through tiny chapters here and there. In the current time, Maud is single. She is best friends with a very eccentric woman named Renata, who lives in the same building that she does. And, you know, her life is quiet and it's lonely, so she's thankful for Renata, even if sometimes the company that she gets is, you know, she's trying to sneak up to her apartment and Renata sticks her head out and is like, come on in for a drink. And even though she, you know, she kind of eye rolls about it sometimes, she truly loves it. So Maud and Mr. Flood meet, and Maud's not taking any of his crap, and Mr. Flood likes that. His name's Cathal Flood. And so what Maud has been tasked to do is cook for him and clean his home. Because, as the other title of this book would suggest, it's jam-packed, this home. It's full of really weird things, oddities, things that he's been collecting for years and years, and it's jam-packed. Even with, like, magazines just stacked to the ceiling and newspapers and things like that. Like, there's just a lot. And so Maud at first, she's like, okay, I'm gonna clean the house. And he's like, no. You can clean the house bits at a time. Like, rooms that I give you permission to enter, you can clean. You can't just have your way in this house. It's my house. It's filled with my things, and I don't want some nosy busybody putting their nose everywhere. So she's like, okay, whatever, just tell me where you want me to clean. In the meanwhile, he's got like just tons of cats everywhere. And so it's proving to be quite the job for Maud. So at first he acts towards her the same as he does towards anyone. You know, he's trying to run her out, but it's not working. It's not working. She's like, no, I'm here to do a job and I'm gonna do it. So you can bugger off. And over time, they sort of develop a bit of a fondness for each other. And she listens to his many stories, and it becomes, you know, a nice friendship. But also, meanwhile that this is all happening, Maud is starting to get a little curious about some of the people from Cathal's past. Like his wife Mary, she died years ago in pretty strange circumstances. Like she had fallen down the stairs and no one really knew much about what had happened. And I guess, you know, the rumor mills as it goes, especially in small towns or whatever, people thought that Cathal had pushed her down the stairs. And as she's cleaning, Maud starts to see photos being left around, kind of like on counters and in bookshelves and things like that. And it'll be faces that she knows, like one of the photos is a young boy, so she takes that to be Mr. Flood's son, because we know he has a son. The son's trying to get him out of his home. And then there'll be like a picture of a young girl too, but the young girl's face will be blacked out with like a marker. Or there'll be a picture of that young boy and then Mr. Flood's wife, but again the face will be blacked out with a marker. His deceased wife's face will be blacked out. And it starts getting really weird. And she's trying to piece together the pieces, like what really happened to Mary Flood. Who's the young girl in the photos? Because there's no talk of the Floods having a daughter. So one day a man comes to the house. He comes up the walk, he knocks on the door. Mr. Flood's like, do not let this SOB in here, like he is freaking out. And so Maud is like, that must be the son. So he comes in anyway, despite Mr. Flood's, you know, insistent that he not. And there's just this sort of whole to do. And then eventually Maud does get him to leave, and it's a whole thing. But the thing that's interesting, and the thing that you don't really realize until later, is that when Gabriel, which is Mr. Flood's son, came to the house just then, even though Mr. Flood was freaking out, get him out of there, he never calls him by name. So, you know, Maud, and we assume that's his son, but it's never told to us. So as it's going on, we're just sort of working our way through the house. She's cleaning the house, she's working through the house, she's listening to Mr. Flood's stories, she's going home at night hanging out with Renata. And Renata at this point is really getting into the mystery of the house and Mary Flood and who's the little girl in the pictures. They're having a bit of fun trying to figure it all out, but at the same time Renata's a little worried about Maud's safety and wants her to, you know, be sure to be safe. Another thing that's interesting about Maud, and this starts happening pretty early on, is she's visited by saints. Like actual saints. And throughout the book, we're not told exactly why or what's happening. We're not told if it's really happening or if it's just sort of happening in her mind. Because we know that when she was a little girl, she used to read and read and read books of saints. It would bring her comfort. She loved reading about all the different saints, and now they appear to her, whether they're wanted or not. So that, to me, that can be taken one of two ways. It can either be taken as, you know, she has some sort of sixth sense, some otherworldly supernatural powers, and she can detect these saints who come to her now after many years of her depending on them through the books she would read, or else, you know, it's just sort of a little thing that she has where she imagines them and finds wisdom within herself through the saints giving it to her. So however you really want to look at that, you can. If you prefer the more supernatural answer or whether you prefer the more logical answer, either one could be right. There's no, it doesn't tell you what it is. It sort of leaves that bit up to interpretation. And that's a very charming, quirky part of the book. Like, it's just quirky in a good sense. You know, I've often described authors trying to be quirky in sort of that eye roll way, but in this it works because it's very charming and it fits in with the rest of the feel of the story. The whole story is written just so charmingly, and it's a beautiful read. Jess Kidd is a fantastic writer. I have read that she's got another book called Himself, and people rave about that, so I'm going to definitely be keeping an eye out for that one as well. But anyway, I'm getting off track here. The Saints. What happens next is Maud meets the last caretaker, the one who was run off before her. And there was a big story that, you know, her boss had warned her about, that the last caretaker who was there, Cathal attacked him, and that was why he had to quit, and he was traumatized and he had to leave. So Maud meets this man. He's very handsome, who was the caretaker before her. And she starts talking to him, trying to get as much information about Cathal as she can. And through that, she finds out that the Floods did have a daughter. She was very troubled, and eventually she ended up in like a mental health home, a mental hospital, something like that. No one's seen her for years and years and years, and everyone's kind of written her off, because what happened eventually was, after she had been in this home for years, allegedly, she ran away, and no one was ever able to find her. Now, as Maud is at work going through the house, she finds, you know, she's been finding the photographs. One day when Cathal is distracted, he was out having his lunch in the backyard, he falls asleep in his, you know, like his sun chair. She goes in and she decides she's going to do a bit more exploring, breaking the rules a little bit, and she goes into parts of the house that beforehand she had not been permitted to access. And she goes up into Barry's room, which is still very much as it had been when she lived there. You know, all of her clothes is still there, and she's just sort of looking through her things, and she's getting weird vibes in there. She can kind of feel the presence of something maybe, and she eventually finds a letter. She brings it to Renata. It's still sealed. They put it in a little plastic baggie because it's like one part of a letter, like you need both the parts to be able to read it. So they keep exploring. Renata's interest is growing. Sam's been hanging out with them a lot, giving his... Sam, or is it Steven? Sam's been spending a ton of time with them, helping them, you know, interested in the clues, interested in what they'd found out. Sometime afterward, when Maud's at work, Renata actually gets attacked in her apartment. A small group of thugs, they break in, they rip her apartment apart. Clearly they're looking for something. They humiliate Renata because she is a transgender woman, so they, you know, they bring her in front of the mirror, they make her take her wig off and her makeup off and just leave her humiliated and scared. And when Maud shows up, she finds Renata sort of huddled in the bathroom, just terrified. But Renata's pleased to announce that despite the fact that they tore the place apart, she had had the foresight beforehand to take the letter that they had found and like hide it in a place where it couldn't and hadn't been found. So that's weird. And while it's going on, you get the idea that it's not Cathal himself, but probably Cathal's son, Gabriel. Because right before this had happened, Gabriel sort of cornered her when she was leaving work one time and asked her if he could take her out for coffee. Despite her not feeling that was appropriate, she went because he made it sound like it was so important. And he tries to pay her to take Cathal out of town. He says, you know, take him on an overnight trip. There's things I need in that house that are mine from my childhood, but the old man won't let me in there, so please. Just take him out of town for the night so I can get in there. And she reluctantly agrees, although she has no intention of actually doing that. But she can feel that, like, this is weird, so she wants to get away from Gabriel. She wants this over with. She wants to get away. So she says, yeah, sure. She takes the money and she goes. And then it's shortly after that Renata is attacked. There's so much that happens in this book. There's so many details, so many characters. It's so difficult for me to sit here and try to explain it all to you in a way that is going to be less than a 45-minute video or longer. So for those of you who don't want spoilers, we're just going to end that here. The story then just goes on to continue unraveling the mystery. Where's his daughter? Why was she put in a mental home? What happened to Mary? All of those things. So like I said, it's a beautifully told story that's very charming, very well crafted. The characters are very interesting. The storyline is well laid out. It's a great book. I will say though, it took me a while to get into it when I started reading it. It was slow going at first. The first maybe 50 pages, I was like, oh, this is slow. I don't think I'm gonna like this. But once it finally picked up speed, it was a fun read, and there's definitely an air of mystery to it, and I liked it enough that I want to go and read her other book himself, because that has rave reviews. So aside from a bit of a slow start, I also found that there were a couple of times throughout the story where it lost speed for a little bit. But it was still good. It was great. I loved the ending. I loved how it concludes. And if you would like to know how that concludes, keep watching. So let's get into the spoilers. What begins to happen, and I'm going to have to speed this up because I don't know how much editing I'm going to have to do, but already I'm up to 25-minute run time for recording. So let's get through this. We quickly begin to learn that the next logical step for Maud is to go to the mental health facility where the daughter had been staying. And so she goes and she talks to them. Wait a minute, you guys. There's something I forgot to explain. Okay. So the daughter, we don't know that it's Mr. Flood's daughter until she goes to this mental health facility to talk to them. Because what we know up until then is that it's Maggie Doone is the name of this girl, and she's gone missing many years ago. And what makes it seem really weird is that Mr. Flood in his home had all the newspaper clippings from when this girl went missing. And so that becomes part of the mystery. They wonder who this girl is. And I quickly referred to her earlier in the video right away as the daughter, because to me it was so obvious that she was the daughter because of the photos, you know. So, but the last name's different, of course. And so for a long time, Maud just thinks this is some random girl that Cathal has like kidnapped, and for all she knows she's still stuck in the house somewhere. So that becomes a bit of a mystery when Maud is going through the home trying to find more evidence to what happened to Mary, wondering who Maggie Dunn is and why he had so many clippings about her disappearance. But to me it was very obvious that it was his daughter right along the whole time, so that's kind of why I forgot to put this bit of info in. But it is important because when she goes to the mental health home, that's when she finds out. What happens after that is that Gabriel goes to the agency that has hired Maud, tells them that Maud took money from him and that he wants her fired, and he wants Mr. Flood put immediately into a home. So that's what's gonna happen, because, you know, he's the son and that's what he's decreed. So Maud goes in and she's like, no, like, yeah, I took the money from him, but he was trying to blackmail me, kind of. Not okay that you're putting him in a home. You said as long as he didn't create any disturbances, he could stay, and he hasn't created any disturbances. So she's heartbroken about it. But there's nothing she can do, and she's been told that she's banned from the house. Meanwhile, Mr. Flood's birthday is coming up, and she had promised him that he would not spend his birthday alone, and she would be there with him. So she goes, as she promised, even though she's not allowed, and they go and they have a nice dinner, and, you know, he knows he's being moved to a home, and there's sadness there, but they try to make the best of the evening. And then for whatever reason, when she's about to leave, she brings it up. She feels like it's her last chance to get info from him. So she asks, like, what happened to Mary? Who's Maggie done? Did you kill her? Did you kill your wife? And he's like, are you honestly, after all the time we've spent together, asking me these questions right now, accusing me of having murdered my own wife, who I adored? And she's like, well, it's the only thing that makes sense. And he is upset. And he says, get out of here. I thought you were my friend. Leave. So she does. Then she goes to the mental health facility. And while she's in there, that's when she finds out that Maggie Dunn is Mr. Flood's daughter, that she had changed her name, and that she had been in there for a while, but she got out, and that's the last anybody saw of her. So the nuns that sort of run the home, Maud is speaking to one. She asks, or the nun volunteers it, like, would you like to look at the family photos and things like that they had? And she says, you know, okay. And she's looking through, and she sees photos of Maggie, and she sees photos of two boys. She recognizes one as Gabriel, and the other one she recognizes as Sam, the alleged former home care worker who has been hanging out with her and Renata, and who she's actually developed a bit more of a personal relationship with. And he's there in the pictures with Gabriel and Maggie. So she says to the nun, she says, who's this guy though? And the nun says, that's her brother, Gabriel. And she's just like, what? And she's like, yeah, it's her brother Gabriel. And she's like, no, I thought this was her brother Gabriel. And she says, no, that was their cousin, Stephen. So, like I had mentioned earlier, when we met Gabriel, he wasn't addressed that by name by Cathal, even though he introduced himself to her as that, and he made it seem like he was that. He was the cousin all along, a cousin we didn't even know existed. So all of a sudden, like, her blood is running cold, because who she thought was Sam is actually Gabriel. So she gets word from the home that has taken Cathal that he's had an accident and he's in the hospital. And so she goes to the hospital, and he's unconscious, and he's laying in his bed. And she's heartbroken that the last thing she said to him was, you know, accusatory about his wife and his daughter. So she knows now different, and she's scared, and she wants to talk to him and apologize and, you know, figure things out. Because one thing she learned when she went to the home to talk about Maggie before she was shown the pictures was that one of the reasons why Maggie had ended up there was because she had tried to drown her brother when her brother was pretty young. And, you know, that of course really set off a lot of alarms for a lot of people, and she ended up in the home. So she's sitting by Cathal's bed, you know, just praying that Gabriel doesn't show up there, and she falls asleep. And when she wakes up, she learns that while she was asleep, Mr. Flood had died. And she's, you know, she's upset and she's heartbroken, and she has so much guilt in her heart that she'll never be able to apologize to him, and that he died thinking that she thought those things of him. So that sucks. So next up, she goes back to the house. She's like, screw it, I'm going in, I'm getting the answers, the final answers that I need. Like, we know the Maggie mystery, but we still don't know what happened to Mary. So she goes back to the house, she goes upstairs, she goes into the room that was Mary Flood's. As she's trying to go through everything, she turns around and Gabriel's there. The real Gabriel, the one who she had grown to know as Sam. And she decides, okay, now's the time to get some information from him. And he says, what do you want to know? And she says, what happened with your sister, first of all? And now here's where we get the whole story. So what the nun had told her was true. Maggie had tried to drown Sam when they were kids. And that, of course, set off a whole thing, and it had led to her being put in the home. But then she did get out, and she came back. And the way Gabriel tells it, she was, she was crazy. She was gonna finish him off, and she was chasing them around, and she was upset, and she was mad. And she tripped and fell and hit her head. Stephen had Gabriel had done then was, after she fell and hit her head, it looked that she was knocked unconscious, and they took her, they picked her up, dragged her across the property, and dumped her in the well in the backyard. And according to him, that's where she still is, where her body is. Then what happened after that was Gabriel had went to the mother and, told her it was this huge accident, it was this big thing, and he's so sorry, and etc., etc. Please don't, can we please just cover this up? And she's kind of like, she's freaking out, as you would be. And I guess what was in those letters were two types of things. The first was she had written a confession because it weighed too heavy on her and she couldn't just carry it inside of her. So she needed to write it down. So she did. And that's the two-part letters that need to be together in order to be fully read. So that is what Stephen, pretending to be Gabriel, had showed up at the house looking for, was these letters, because he knew his father wasn't long left for this world. And he wanted it out of there before anyone who was cleaning the house would find it. The second thing he was looking for was his mother's revised will, because this was a huge house, they had a lot of money, but it was his mother's money, not his father's. So he needed to find the revised will that stated that when his father finally died, the house went to him. Because when you've got a dead body in the backyard in a well, you want to make sure the house stays in your hands and doesn't get passed along. So that's what he's there looking for. And as they're talking, there's crashing and banging. And she's like, what's that? And he says that that's Stephen downstairs getting ready to burn down the house. So he's like, you're not going to tell, are you? And she's like, no, of course not. And he's like, that's what I told Stephen. I told him we didn't have to worry about you. So then he's like, let's get out of here. So she goes ahead of him. Why, I don't know. And then, of course, he attacks her from behind, because you're not just going to let someone go who knows that you've murdered someone and have put someone in the backyard in a well. So he attacks her, he thinks he's killed her, and he leaves, but he hasn't killed her, even though she's in very bad shape. She manages to drag herself out, and the cops come because the house is on fire, and she's able to tell them about Mr. Flood's daughter, where her body is, everything like that. And what we later learn is that both Gabriel and Stephen were killed in the fire because they had gotten themselves in a part of the house where, something fell and they got blocked and weren't able to leave. So that kind of brings an end to the whole Flood family story. And what we learn, too, is kind of, I don't even know if it's actually outright stated, but we get the very strong feeling that it was Gabriel that killed his mother, pushed her down the stairs. And maybe we are outright told. I can't remember. But like, you know that Gabriel's the one that killed his mother, not Mr. Flood. And so getting all this info just really adds to her being so sad that she accused Mr. Flood in the first place, and that second of all, he's not around for her to apologize to. So yeah, there you go. That's Mr. Flood's Last Resort. It was good. It's not one of my favorite books of all time, but I enjoyed it. Once I got past that beginning, that was just so slow for me personally. I struggled with that beginning, but once I got into it, once the story got rolling, I loved it. The very, very final scene is Maud talking to Renata, and her telling us and Renata that she's off to try to find her own sister, who, if you remember from the beginning, her own sister had gone missing. So that had been really one of the things that fueled the wanting to find out what really happened, because she related to, a young girl goes missing. She could relate to that because her sister so many years ago had gone missing. And so now she is off to try to find her own sister. So a fitting ending, if ever there was. So yes, thanks so much for watching, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this. If you've read this book yourself, let me know what you thought of it. Have you read Jess Kidd's other book, Himself? What'd you think of that one? And I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.